Vladimir Putin's war is in trouble. Military and economic pressure are mounting on him by the day. Russia's oil refineries are being blitzed by Ukraine's deep strikes. Now, so are its oil tankers. And Crimea, his prized trophy, is being squeezed with resupply routes cut off. If Putin is cornered, the fears are that he could lash out. So how might he do it, and when? I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. Welcome to The General and the Journalist. We're pleased to welcome Mark Galeotti back to the podcast. Mark is a historian, lecturer, and writer, and one of the best experts on modern Russia that we have. He's also a Sunday Times columnist and has his own excellent podcast called In Moscow's Shadows. Welcome back, Mark.
Great to be with you again.
Mark, good to see you. The last time we spoke to you, it was in March, and it was discussed Putin's paranoia. We had a wonderful discussion about why he was lining the Kremlin walls with armed guards and turning off the internet in every city he could think of. It turns out in July, he does have quite serious good reason to be paranoid. The reason being, Ukraine's been pretty busy over the last few months, hasn't they, Patrick?
He has. I mean, the thing that really caught my eye with the Ukrainians are a couple of really significant developments. So you remember that we spent quite a lot of time talking about how Ukraine has managed to achieve a functional defeat of the Black Sea Fleet without even having a navy. Well, what they're now doing is to take that example, and they're effectively fighting an air campaign without a conventional air force. And what this has allowed them to do is to fight almost as NATO would, where you try to achieve air superiority and you use your air force to strike Russia throughout their depth. I think we were talking about this last week. So simultaneously hitting tactical targets on the battlefield, operational level targets, what we might call air interdiction. So these are the mid-range strikes, and this is particularly pertinent when it comes to isolating Crimea. And then the ones we're reading so much about, which is the sort of strategic bombing campaign, and that's hitting targets primarily related to economic warfare and so on. And they've done all that without an air force. And what they've done is they've used unmanned systems to achieve it. So it's a remarkable turnaround from where they were just 2 years ago, let alone 4 years ago.
It really is, and the pace is picking up, it seems, week by week, day by day. So let's just update listeners on just how far Ukraine has got and how backwards Russia is going in all this. First, there's a fuel crisis, because, and these numbers are absolutely amazing, the new Eurasian Strategy Center report that Ukraine has struck at least 25 different Russian oil refineries now. 13 of them, over half, are either partially or completely out of use. The Institute for the Study of War report that Ukraine have hit 90 different Russian oil tankers, and that's the big new development of the last week, in the Sea of Azov. Over just 6 days.
That's an incredible number. I mean, that's almost Battle of Atlantic standards.
It is, and that is apparently because there is a bottleneck at the Straits of Kerch going in and out of the Sea of Azov, going into the Black Sea. So they're just knocking them off. But it's all meant intense fuel shortages, rationing at petrol stations all across Russia. It's getting so bad that they're now importing fuel from India. Russia is basically a country sitting on a sea of gas and oil. So for it to have to import oil and gas is pretty amazing. And it could get worse, because the economic pressure could well ramp up further now that Donald Trump has just agreed, so we think, to sign what's called the Graham-Blumenthal bill, which is a bill authored by the very recently late Senator Lindsey Graham, that would allow the US to impose secondary sanctions on anyone who buys Russian oil.
Not before time.
Not before time. And of course, there's Trump's love-in with Zelensky. We saw that at the NATO summit last week, that their bromance seems to be increasing as Ukraine appears to be winning, because Trump doesn't half love a winner. The big move last week was he allowed Zelensky to start building Patriot air defense missiles in Kyiv.
So on top of the fuel and the economic pressure, we've of course got the strain on manpower and the casualty rates. So we now know that as many as 450,000 battlefield deaths have been inflicted on Russia over this war, and about 1.4 million casualties during the course of the war. That's according to CSIS figures. They're taking monthly casualty rates of over 30,000. That's exceeding what they're able to recruit. The casualty rate compared to Ukraine is nearly 8-1 in the first half of this year. So, there's a question about how sustainable that. But the real reason we want to talk about is this stranglehold, this isolation that the Ukrainians are now establishing over Crimea, and the shipping in the Kerch Strait that you were talking about. So, Mark, when you look at those four pressure points, which do you think is having the greatest impact?
It's the usual dilemma of long versus short term. In the long term, clearly the overall casualty figures are crucial because, when it comes down to it, that slowly grinds down Russia's capacity to fight the war wherein way it wants to fight it. In other words, on a territorial basis, with Putin clearly still being determined that he's going to get that last 20 or so percent of Donetsk region so that he can claim, we have taken all of the Donbass region. However, in the short term, it's Crimea. Crimea, no question, is really the current potential flashpoint, because what we are seeing is clearly a campaign to essentially not prepare the ground necessarily for a military assault on Crimea, but instead they're just simply making it untenable to hold on to it. At what point do we start to see, for example, a huge outflow of just ordinary people from Crimea who are saying, well, you know what? I actually like to have running water and electricity and food and fuel oil, and therefore we are going to get the hell out of Dodge. At what point does, in a way, this become not the crowning triumph, as it was obviously once framed, of Putin's foreign policy, but instead a very, very dangerous weakness? And that is why I think, although Putin is not by nature a man who makes decisions quickly or easily, and he would much rather sit on the fence and just hope things work out, this is why I think it's getting harder and harder for him not to make a decision of some kind, whether it means peace, which is unlikely, or whether it means some kind of escalation, which is worrying, but more likely.
Is there a military impact of losing control of Crimea? Is it a point of power projection platform? What is it that makes Crimea critical to the operational campaign?
I mean, it was a logistics node, as near as I can tell, precisely because of the degree to which we had this very effective sort of strangulation siege by drone that has already taken place. I think that's becoming less of a factor, and we see supplies for the Russian forces in the southeast of Ukraine now being much more actually provided directly from the mainland by land routes or by drone in a few cases. So I think that the logistics role has diminished. What really still matters is actually the use of the air bases. Crimea is still the site from which the Russians can and do launch drone and air strikes into southern Ukraine. And it gives them a capacity to, overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses by the fact that they can therefore send in their attacks from all sorts of different directions, but also actually send them shorter distances, again, to minimize the chance of the Ukrainians being able to respond. So if they lose that, then in a way, their strikes against southern Ukraine will have to take sort of longer routes, and therefore be easier to identify and, if need be, shoot down. It is just the wider political dimension. And remember, this is a politician who, above all, is interested in survival. That is the primary goal. And I think there is that sense from people around Putin, at least. It's very hard to know quite what Putin thinks. But from people around Putin, there is clearly a sense of unease that we haven't seen before. I think we are in a serious moment. Yes, of course, all of this has a military impact in that if you can't fly your planes out of Crimea and so forth, then that limits your capacity to deliver these long-range KAB bomb strikes, which are such a devastating element of the Russian arsenal. But I don't think we're at that stage yet. We're at a political rather than a military stage.
And I guess the political dimension of this is wrapped up in how the Russian population see it. I mean, you were in Moscow, I think, when Putin seized Crimea, announced it. Mm-hmm. Was the euphoria, the upsurge in national pride that you saw and you talked about then, is the reverse of that, the flip side of that there is enough emotional attachment to Crimea that this really does become an existential political problem for Putin?
To a degree. I mean, I think we have to distinguish from the fact that when Crimea was taken, it was an essentially bloodless, easy victory. It's not just that this portion of Ukraine that pretty much every Russian thinks is rightfully Russian was just simply sort of handed away to Ukraine in the 1950s unfairly, had been returned. It's that it was just so easy. There's just no question that having built it up so much as precisely one of the examples of the successful and ultimately sort of patriotic nature of the Putin regime, the Kremlin would now find it very, very hard to step back at all. So I think that's the crucial point. When you have invested so much into making something essentially a sort of a totem of your success, you can't just quietly hand it back or just simply abandon it and not expect some kind of political backlash.
And from a cultural perspective, and I know you touched on this, we all remember Putin's interesting interpretation of history. What is the emotion? What's the sort of cultural attachment that Putin feels? His historical view of Crimea.
Again, this is part of the way in which he's hoisted by his own petard. He has made Crimea not just a sort of a part of Russia that was wrongly handed to Ukraine, but also very much invested it with this sort of spiritual role. This idea that Chersonesos on the Crimean Peninsula is in some ways the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy. And although, look, historians can and do quibble with much of what Putin says, he is the worst kind of historian, the sort who knows the argument he wants to prove and then just simply picks the evidence that seems to support it. But nonetheless, what we have is this idea that Crimea is a strategic location, that it is a point of national pride, and that it is also of immense spiritual value. Putting all that together, that's quite a price tag.
Vladimir Putin does rather sound like my A-level history essays, I must admit, which weren't very good. Mark, I'm really interested if we pan out from Crimea to the whole picture now, especially those petrol queues, ordinary Russians having to see oil refineries blow up in front of them when on the motorways, with incredible footage we're seeing all over social media of that. I was really struck by something I read the other day. A man you're familiar with, Vladimir Solovyov, who is Rossiya One, Russia's big TV station, their main propagandist in chief. The guy loves to come on and rant about how awful NATO is. Apparently viewers now, instead of sending him supportive texts, are now saying, this is all well and good, but why don't you sign up for Ukraine? Put your money where your mouth and do some fighting yourself. How reflective of that anecdote is where the Russian people are? How fed up are they and how close to boiling point are they?
Well, two different things. Fed up and boiling point. So let's address the fed up. Look, this was not a war that Russians had been asking for. It's not as though in January 2022 people were inveighing against Putin, saying, well, why hasn't he invaded Ukraine already? They were, in some cases, perfectly willing to be convinced after the event by Putin's propaganda that this is actually a necessary war. But very much central to that was this sense of an implicit social contract, which is, look, you don't protest about the war, even though many Russians did protest. But anyway, you don't protest about the war, and the war will not really affect you. After all, this is a war that is fought by volunteers. Volunteers were offered huge sums of money to sign up, and therefore, on the whole, they have come from the impoverished parts of the country. It's not been the sort of metropolitan Muscovites and so forth who go and fight. And to a considerable degree, let's be clear, many people were willing to accept that, or at least not buck against the trend, because you knew that, on the other hand, if you did protest, then you would very quickly be targeted by the security forces and could face some very, very serious punishments for you and indeed for your family. Now, what we find, though, is that implicit social contract has been broken. We have food prices going up. What your average Russian is spending about 40% of their take-home budget on food. And now we have the issue of petrol. And look, for many Russians, they don't necessarily have a car or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. As you said, it's not just simply about the kilometer-long queues outside petrol stations and the like. It is the fact that this is a very, very visible sign of the war coming home, that precisely the great billowing clouds of black smoke, the huge gouts of flame, the internet outages, which are justified on the basis of an attempt to try and prevent Ukrainian drones using them to finally home in on their targets. All of these things are saying to Russians, this war that you were told would be quick, would be cheap, would be easy, and above all, wouldn't affect you directly, really is affecting you. Russians are fed up, but they don't really feel that they can afford or risk to do anything about it at this stage.
at
But
this
again,
stage being rather crucial.
exactly. Well, yeah, watch this, watch this space, and particularly because in September there are due to be elections to the State Duma, the Russian parliament. Now, on one level, of course, we all know that Russian quote unquote democracy is a farce, that the election results will be rigged so that whatever result the political technologists of the presidential administration want to announce will be announced. But they're also painfully aware that the bigger the gap between the real result and the announced result, then the less legitimate the outcome and the more likely there is to see for protests. We saw the biggest protests in post-Soviet times back in 2011, 2012, precisely were triggered by widespread revulsion at rigged elections. So, I think this is one of the reasons why this becomes a particularly uncomfortable moment for a political regime which was hoping it could just simply surf to an easy win.
Mark, here's a question for you. A rational man might think, well, it's all beginning to turn against me, so I know what I'll do. I'll call a ceasefire, freeze the battle lines where they are, and I'll go to a nice parley at the negotiating table.
Yeah, absolutely. And had Vladimir Vladimirovich given me a call to ask for my advice, that's very much what I would advise. The trouble is, it is very clear that our notions of common sense are not necessarily Putin's. We probably were also sort of struck by that in February 2022, when his invasion of Ukraine seemed to make no sense. And it's not that Putin is some kind of irrational lunatic. It's more that it's a proof of the fact that even rational actors can make deeply stupid decisions based on what they're told and what their assumptions are. And there are people who are absolutely trying to persuade Putin to do precisely what you said. We've seen an increasingly open, strikingly open debate taking place within the elite. Things that we know were being said behind closed doors in previous years are now coming out in newspaper op-eds and so forth. People saying precisely, look, we can't allow this to become a forever war. We've reached a point of diminishing returns. Let's just try and freeze the conflict, start some kind of negotiations, which, if we want, we can spin them out forever, or we can hopefully get sanctions relief or something as a result. Would seem to be admirably commonsensical, except the trouble is that that same argument that says, look, we can't let this war just drag out, is also being used by ultra hawks to say, and that's why we need to escalate. That's why we need to pull out all the stops, impose some kind of military solution quickly. And yes, in the short term, it's going to be disruptive and expensive and dangerous. But the point is, we do it quickly, then we can essentially stop the war on our terms. And once we've done that, people will essentially forgive us what we've done. So, it's a much more dangerous route, but it seems at the moment, to be the one that actually Putin is more inclined to.
Mark, can I just explore what a ceasefire strategy might look like? Because, I mean, there is historical precedent for it, isn't there? This is effectively what he did in 2014, or after 2014, with the Minsk agreement, and where he froze the conflict. And you could sort of paint to a scenario where he freezes the battle lines where they are. He offers President Trump a strategic win ahead of the midterms by allowing him to claim, the Nobel Peace Prize or whatever it is for settling the war, claim credit for it, and then sets about sowing division between Europe and the US and within Europe, and all the while, and then also sowing division within Ukrainian society and playing up on the allegations of corruption and so on. I mean, that to me does feel like this is probably not an adjective, but a Putinian approach.
It does. And also, all that time, he would presumably be reconstituting his rather badly battered armed forces, which allows him to also be thinking about another round if need be. All true, except that, remember that to Putin, who doesn't really believe Ukraine is a country, and who increasingly is willing to use the word war, not special military operation, because he's framing Ukraine as just simply one battlefield, a particularly kinetic battlefield in a wider struggle with, I was going to say the West, but really it's Europe, broadly constituted to include us. From his point of view, I think he doesn't believe that there is real agency in Ukraine. He doesn't believe that this implacably Russophobic Europe could be broken apart adequately by disinformation and subversion and all these other kind of tactics. So, I mean, again, I don't want to prejudge, because if nothing else, Putin does change his mind. One of the virtues of him being so secretive in his decision making is that he can do that without necessarily losing face. But I think, although I absolutely agree that there is that kind of Putinian rationale to this approach, I think he has built this challenge up to such an existential one that he really feels that he needs to seize what he needs to seize and then sort of fix the situation, and probably to try and then do so in a way that Ukraine cannot reconstitute its own military and essentially assert its own security. So, never say never, but at the moment he seems inclined to think that actually he needs to escalate.
And Mark, the benefits of escalating, lashing out at the West, I guess are twofold. One would be as a diversion tactic to a very fed up Russian population. Look over there, look at this new patriotic fight, whatever it might be. The other would be to scare off NATO, to try and force NATO into a better peace deal from his point of view, pushing more pressure on Ukraine to settle for less.
Yes, I mean, look, I think it's fair to say that there's pretty limited traction on the whole. This is our enemy, the West. I mean, he's been banging this drum for years with no sign that anyone really wants to march to that particular beat. But nonetheless, I'm sure they would use that. Going back to the example of Solovyov, I mean, this is exactly the kind of propaganda nonsense that he's been pushing out for so long. And the fact that he's now getting actual more resistance from his own audience, again, suggests that I think it's really been rather tapped out. But precisely, it's this sense of trying to scare the West. We see this. This is why he every now and then sort of hinted about the potential use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. This is why, every now and then he's perfectly willing to see the odd drone, whether it's actually by accident or deliberately or by accident, cross over the borders into the West. Oops, my mistake, knowing full well that that's not going to trigger some kind of Article 5 NATO response, but precisely will trigger certain constituencies in the West who say, oh my gosh, this is spiraling out of control. We need to end this. And if it means putting pressure to bear on Kyiv to accept some kind of ugly deal, then so be it. He's been trying all this. He may well try it more. But the trouble is that I would say we're in a situation in which he has no more easy options. All of his various escalatory options, whether it's kind of propaganda or whether it's on the battlefield, really are self-harming ones. Doesn't mean that he won't do them, but nonetheless, we have to accept that they all have very serious price tags.
Yeah, very serious risk, which brings us neatly onto exactly where we wanted to go next, which was how might he do all this? And here's one for you, Patrick, because the military have got a quite neat way of explaining escalation, haven't you? It's horizontal or vertical, basically. Just explain what those two are.
I mean, in the worst case, you can have both at the same time. But if I just take them, a vertical escalation, and Mark was talking about earlier on, is effectively intensifying the conflict, the existing conflict, the conflict within Ukraine. And there are two obvious levers that Putin can pull on. The first, which Mark, I think, was right to dismiss, is the notion of nuclear escalation, because in Russian military doctrine, the use of nuclear on the escalation ladder occurs, much higher levels. But secondly would be to mobilize, to mobilize the country for, if not total war, something approximating that. And we are hearing reports, and I'll be fascinated to hear what Mark thinks in a second, that there are steps being taken to conduct some general mobilization, or at least partial mobilization, immediately following the elections in September. So we'll be watching that carefully.
That means conscription, a second round of conscription that'd be incredibly unpopular.
Or simply mobilizing people who have been trained, who've been through conscription. And then secondly, horizontal escalation is the notion that you expand beyond the borders of this conflict. And that would be to challenge NATO. It would be to impose a cost on those NATO countries that have been active in supporting Ukraine. We would almost certainly, in fact, I would expect to see an intensification, a broadening of the sort of hybrid tactics, whether that's attacks on critical national infrastructure, whether it's assassinations, sabotage, active measures, as they used to describe it in the Soviet Union. That I think you can price in. But where it might also take us is towards direct attacks on, even if deniable, on NATO states like Latvia. There's reporting that Poland is on heightened alert and seeing intelligence, that suggests some form of Russian aggression towards it. And then it might also include some of the scenarios that we've talked about before in the Baltic states, particularly Latvia, or indeed, worst case, somewhere like Svalbard.
So, Mark, you've heard Patrick's description there. Which of those horizontal escalations, in other words, Putin coming for us in the West, do you think he'd be most minded to go for?
Well, look, I mean, I think the idea that he'll intensify his covert campaign is almost certain. And I think particularly we will see it directed towards the factories, the transport infrastructures, which are responsible for providing assistance to the Ukrainians. I would not want to be working on the Polish railways. But in some ways, look, there's a limit to just how effective that can be, at least, especially without actually crossing the boundaries into being absolutely sort of overtly involved. The Russians are doing a lot of work using these so-called disposable agents, essentially local thugs, like the people who carried out the Leighton arson attack in London, who are not sophisticated sabotage experts by any means. They're just guys whom you can offer to pay a bit of money for them to throw a few Molotov cocktails at something or plant something on a railway line. So you can do a certain amount of that. The next stage up will be talking about assassinations and the like. We could actually see, if the Russians really wanted to start getting sharp-toothed, is attacks on industrialists, particular influencers, maybe some politicians, particularly heavily associated with this idea, just to give that sense of, if you speak out really strongly against Moscow, maybe there'll be an attack on you, or, well, as Keir Starmer discovered, maybe we'll try and your car will catch fire, or whatever else. So, it is possible that they would actually move up that way. But again, that begins to come close to existing taboos. And ironically, here Putin's going to be a victim of his own paranoias. The idea of some kind of military response, we did have these reports from Poland, digging into actually the original. It seems to have been more than just evidence that there had been contingency planning in Moscow for what would we do if we got the orders from the Kremlin to escalate.
Mark, just to be clear, this was a report last week of US intelligence apparently warning the Poles that there may be a Russian incursion over the border on the way to Kaliningrad in the Suwalki Gap.
Yeah, exactly. And it just seems to have been more precisely people sort of essentially trying to come up with plans just in case, contingency planning, without any sense that any kind of decision had been made behind it. There's certainly no evidence at the moment that the Russians would want to escalate like that, not least because, remember, they are a tad busy. I mean, the forces at their disposal are severely limited, and especially the kind of, the Spetsnaz special forces, the sort of people whom they would want to deploy. Well, they were thoroughly decimated back in 2022 when they essentially found themselves being just thrown into the role of light infantry. And even now, I mean, they are overstretched in Ukraine. So, again, there are limits. Now, again, when it comes down to it, if Putin decides, then the generals can't turn around and say, I'm sorry, boss, we don't have the people. They'll have to somehow find the people. But certainly at present, I think they're more focused on a campaign of escalation in Ukraine rather than a horizontal campaign to really get things much more serious in their confrontation with the West.
So a lot of that makes a lot of sense to me. But the one thing I just question is, you query whether Putin really wants to cross a line that we would see here over in the West with NATO. He's a master at that. The Salisbury attacks, the Novichok poisoning of the Skripals, that was brilliantly calculated from a very fiendish point of view of to do something that was horrific, clearly had Russian fingerprints all over it, but calculated clever to, fine, get a few spy expulsions, but not really cause too much trouble. So it feels to me a targeted assassination, perhaps an anchor crossing over an undersea cable and cutting off our banking supply for a day. These sort of things would be fairly likely.
I think, I mean, you mentioned breaking cables, and that again, I could absolutely see that. Though bear in mind that actually the modern communications infrastructure is actually moderately resilient. You'd have to drag your anchor through a fair number of cables to really have a severe impact. But in terms of assassinations and the like, you're absolutely right in terms of the calibration of threat around Litvinenko and Skripal. But that was a very different context. There is this sense that this Russian sense that the West is essentially quite morally flabby. It doesn't like crossing demarcation lines. But as far as Putin is concerned, we have already crossed a lot of lines. We are already essentially encouraging and supporting with weapons and intelligence and everything else the Ukrainians to kill Russians and hammer the Russian economy. So that sense that, sure, we might not try and do exactly the same. We might not actually have British assassins going after someone in Russia, not least because Russia is a very hard target from a counterintelligence point of view. But on the other hand, given how often the Ukrainians have been doing it, the idea that we would turn to GUR, Ukrainian military intelligence, or the SBU, their other intelligence service, and say, look, what do you need? What do you need to kill us 5 generals? That's the kind of thing I think that if you're Putin, you assume that we would do. Whether we actually would is another question.
So, Mark, we've talked about the various escalatory options that that Putin has, and particularly and potentially catalyzed by what's going on in Crimea. We try and call it at the end of each episode, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But I'm trying to gauge from you what his likely approach is going to be. I mean, Mark Carney said recently, it's only a matter of time, but Putin will lose this war. So on that basis, do you think he is likely to escalate in order to prevent that or in response to Crimea? And if so, when? Because we've had a range of dates. And I think you yourself have talked about, the potential for something happening in late September. John Bew, who we had on last week, sketched out the sort of challenges that the new prime minister could face. Zelensky at Ankara talked about 2027. When do what would Putin do and when?
I wish that I can be proven wrong, but I do think he is going to launch a new partial mobilization. Not a total one, because if nothing else, the Russian forces can't possibly metabolize 1 million, 2 million reservists or whatever. But, talking 200,000-300,000 troops. They will be bad troops because on the whole, the people who had been contract servicemen, in other words, volunteers serving sort of, reasonable tours, they were largely swept up in the first mobilization wave that took place in September of 2022. So we're talking about people who maybe have done 1 year of national service. They might just about know the dangerous end of a Kalashnikov, but probably not much more than that. So bad troops, but a lot of them, and fresh troops. The question is of timing. Now, under most circumstances, I think Putin would want to wait until after the elections. But the point is, if you call a mobilization at the end of September, maybe you'll have your troops available at the end of October. That's quite a long time for Crimea to weather this current storm. If we, for example, hear tomorrow that they've decided to cancel or suspend the elections, then basically I think that a mobilization is going to be taking place within days. Frankly, whether it's before or after the elections, I suspect it'll be after, just again, because I think Putin will just, true to form, put off making a tough decision, even though his generals are saying, if you want to do it now, rather than for winter. When in winter, we're going to be hammering the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Remember, they're already down from 60 gigawatt to 20 gigawatt production. So they're already in a weakened position, and we're going to blast them, and that'll surely get the Ukrainians into a more malleable frame of mind. Not that I think that would happen. But so I think mobilization, yes, and more likely to be after the September elections than before. But as I said, I would be delighted to be proven wrong.
Well, it's a pretty sobering prospect, particularly if you're Ukrainian or a strong supporter of the Ukrainians as we are. I guess one final question then. If you're right, and we assume that the Ukrainians can weather the storm because they have, with our support, if this mobilization gamble, and I think it probably is a gamble because it may be difficult to recover from, doesn't play out, what might happen in the political space in Russia?
This is absolutely a gamble, and particularly it's a gamble because, remember, Putin, for all his fascination with matters military, doesn't seem to understand much about it. And I think he has this rather sort of simplistic notion that 200,000 extra troops means you're going to necessarily advance at such and such a greater pace, whereas there are no guarantees of that whatsoever. If, though, this gamble is thoroughly unsuccessful, if he can't see Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, the last two of the so-called fortress cities, brought under his control, I think we move into really uncharted territory, because I think he would begin to become something of a lame duck figure, even as regards Russians. Remember, Putin has created this system in which everyone obeys out of fear or out of self-interest. It's not loyalty to Putin that manifests itself. And if you begin to feel that actually Putin's going to drag the whole system down, that's the point when you might begin to think that the risk-benefit assessment of trying to move against him is beginning to change. Up to now, the view has been a lot of people are very unhappy with his leadership, but the point is the risks seem to be so great and the chances of success so limited. So basically, everyone just kept their head down and just hoped things worked out. Mm-hmm. If, in fact, things look as if they're going to be heading in much more dangerous direction, if you're beginning to get, as is likely, protests because of mobilisation and a fear of further mobilisation waves, if the economy continues to slide down into deeper stagnation, if you can't, people can't fill up their cars, well, put all that together and people might start to think, in fact, that the smart money is not on continuing to stay with Putin, but to move against him. Mm-hmm. And, again, I think it's one of these first mover issues. At present, no one really wants to be the one to start those dangerous conversations, because you don't know if the person you're talking to can be trusted. But once that conversation starts, remember when we saw the Prigozhin mutiny, a few thousand people could spear, almost all the way to Moscow. Not because they battled their way through and there were some kind of Spartans taking on the Persians, but basically because a lot of the security forces along the line of march decided, well, we're not going to join the mutiny, but nor are we going to do anything to stop it. Well, just see what happens. And I think Putin might find, and ironically might discover what actually happened around him in East Germany when it collapsed, is that a state which can look really powerful and dangerous and forceful can evaporate surprisingly quickly when everyone decides that actually this is not basically the right horse to back.
Well, it's going to be an absolutely fascinating autumn. Mark, thank you so much for that. That was an absolutely fascinating tour de force, and we wait with bated breath for the next move.
Yes, thanks, Mark.
Always a pleasure.
So we've got a listener's question from an emergency medicine doctor and former British Army doctor called Rob. He says that he listens every week to the current state of the world and British forces, but also sees the parlous state of the NHS and its impact on the health and morale of the British public. So Rob's question is, how would you advise the incoming Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, to approach balancing warfare versus welfare? Tom, I think this is firmly in your wheelhouse.
This is a political question, isn't it? You're going to duck this one, and rightly. This is the absolute nub of kind of everything we've been talking about for the last month or so: the defence investment plan, the failure to pay for Britain's rearming, Britain not spending enough on defence, not keeping up with Germany and Poland's defence spending. And the key is, where do you find the money? So let's look at precisely how much we do spend on welfare as a country. And the figure is astronomical: £333 billion this year, annually, and the bill will keep on going up as we go on. Add health spending to that of another 200 billion, you're getting on for $500 billion, which is about half the government spends on everything, right? So we're kind of like a welfare state and a health service on top of not necessarily very much else anymore. Military spending, defence spending is about 75 billion a year now, going up a tiny bit. So that's the comparison. We spend about a quarter on the military as we do on welfare. And Tony Blair came up with this amazing statistic the other day, which is benefit spending on incapacity benefits, sickness benefits, is it'll go up in 5 years by as much as we spend on the military alone. So it's going to go up by about 70 billion. And I think anyone, Patrick, not just military aficionados like you and I, would think that balance is out of place. So he needs to correct that balance. If he wants to find money for the military, He's got to take it from welfare spending because there's kind of nowhere else really. It can't really rip up roads anymore. All that spending's been cut as well. The key is how. And the how is you engage people in the debate. You have this debate. You put it in front of the British people and say, folks, we've got to trade off. We've got to look at this really seriously. We've got to protect ourselves. Do we need to be spending this much more on welfare? Can we cut back a bit? And it's the debate Keir Starmer never had, and I think that contributed to his downfall. Let's see about Andy Burnham. Read an interesting piece in the Times the other day, which he said we need to level with the British people about defence spending. That to me, maybe I'm just being Panglossy again, that to me might signify he gets it. But we're going to find out maybe next week.
We are. Great question, Rob. I hope you may not like Tom's answer, but I think it's a pretty straight one. Well, that's all from us this week. Thanks for listening, and do send in any of your questions to generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk.
Please also leave us a review, rate us on wherever you listen to your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, whatever it might be, because it helps others to find us and scratches our neediness. Until next week, thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom.